Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Sunday. Thanks for being here. We have two great guests, Kristi Noem, that's right, Secretary of DHS, and our buddy Charles Payne. We'll discuss the economy and the government. But before we do that, I continue to think about the horrendous tragedy that happened over the Potomac at Reagan National Airport. And at the same time, really, in the same news cycle, Donald Trump sought to freeze for 60 days spending, not spending on Social Security or Medicare or anything like that, but spending on left-wing causes, woke causes. He wants to know about these non-governmental organizations. They're receiving hundreds of millions, if not billions and billions of dollars. And Washington went nuts. And the most radical federal judge appointed by Biden, who sits in the district court in Washington, D.C., she said, I'm going to put a temporary restraining order on that. So she effectively froze Donald Trump's freeze. And so that's been adjusted somewhat without getting into the weeds, but it got me to thinking. I think you and I better take a step back and see what's going on in this country and what's being done to us. How is it possible that the tower at Reagan National Airport, that turns out to be the busiest airport in the country, probably one of the smallest, is understaffed? How is that possible with all the money we're spending? And the answer is that. We are spending so much money. The government's so ubiquitous. It is so massive. It is so involved in everything that it can't do anything right. It's impossible to control it. What was to be a relatively innocuous federal government operating from a defined enumeration of specific grants of power, as I explained in Liberty and Tyranny, has become an ever-present and unaccountable force. It is the nation's largest creditor, debtor, lender, employer, consumer, contractor, grantor, property owner, tenant, insurer, healthcare provider, and pension guarantor. And I'm sure there's much more. And with aggrandized police powers, what it does not control directly, it bans or mandates by regulation. That's the problem. Here's your Constitution. The national government's supposed to be limited. Governmental powers not mentioned in here belong to the states. And beyond that, you, the American people, you have your freedom. The private sector has its freedom. The Ninth Amendment is in effect the enshrinement in our governing document of the Declaration of Independence. The 10th Amendment is federalism. Doesn't even matter anymore? What kind of a republic is this? Is it a republic? Is it a federal republic? I should say not. The action's in Washington, not in the states. Okay. Is it a representative republic? I should say not. The vast majority of laws that we have to live under aren't passed by Congress. They're issued by fiat, by the massive bureaucracy. Well, what's left? Are we a constitutional republic? I don't know. Have you read the Constitution lately? Is this a limited government with limited powers? Doesn't seem like it. So what kind of a government is it? It's a government that's transitioning into a tyrannical, centralized police state, which Donald Trump is trying to wrestle to the ground. We have a federal workforce of 3 million civilians, minus the post office, it's 2.4 million. That's big. State and local governments, together they have nearly 20 million people, including teachers. About 10 million people work for the federal government as federal contractors on top of employees. Over 7 million if you exclude military and post office contractors. There are almost 3,000 counties in America. We don't have the foggiest idea how many contractors work for them and how many employees are involved in that. This is massive. For the first 7 months of fiscal year 2024, which began last October, net interest payments totaled $514 billion. That's interest on the debt, outpacing defense spending by $20 billion for the first time in American history. And budget analysts think that trend's going to continue, making 2024 the first year ever the United States will spend more on interest payments than on national security. The go-broke date for Social Security trust funds is 2035, according to the trustees of the Social Security Medicare programs. 2035, that's not that far away. My calculation, not that I'm a mathematician, that's 10 years from now. Medicare's hospital insurance trust fund is projected to run out in 2036. Why? Because they took money out of these trust funds to spend on general operating expenses. And they keep adding benefits to these programs, and they keep adding people. like illegal aliens to these programs. They're going broke. And what are they doing about it? Not a damn thing. Do they even care? No, they don't care. Now let's talk about these regulations, as I wrote about in Rediscovering Americanism. The Congressional Research Service recently reported that according to the Office of the Federal Registrar, and this is from 2017, this is 8 years ago, the number of final rules published each year by the executive branch, by the bureaucracy, is generally in the range of 2,500 to 4,500 rules. Those rules are aimed at you. Do you know what they are? Of course not. Do you know who promulgated them? Of course not. You have the foggiest idea. Well, that's not representative government, is it? The Competitive Enterprise Institute determined that by December 30, 2016. That's 9 years ago. In a record-setting federal registrar of 97,110 pages, every year the government issues a federal registrar with the regulations. That year, there were almost 100,000 pages. Agencies had issued 3,853 rules and regulations, 43 more than the year before, and 18 times the number of laws Congress passed during the same year. The vast majority of laws are passed by faceless, nameless bureaucrats. Can you lobby them? You don't even know who they are. Most of them don't even go into the office to work. What are you supposed to do? Knock on the door and go to their home and say, hey, can I talk to you about that regulation? It's so completely out of control. But it's worse. The National Taxpayer Union Foundation, as Congress considers the debt ceiling deal, and they wrote this 2 years ago, lawmakers should be mindful of a GAO, Government Accountability Office report that Congress titled The Nation's Fiscal Health, published earlier this month. Again, this is a couple of years ago. The report begins with a stark warning about the federal debt. Quote, the federal government faces an unsustainable long-term fiscal future. Wow, and those Democrats are very concerned about it. Have you noticed? Again, that 60-day freeze, which basically froze all this money going into these leftist organizations and woke programs, they almost had a heart attack. There was Schumer davening again. I can't believe what's going on here. They want to cut Social Security and Medicare. No, they don't. Didn't say anything about it. The annual fiscal health report examines the future fiscal path of the federal government by running a 75-year simulation, extrapolating current policies for revenue and program spending into the future. Is this boring, everybody? I hope not, because this is about you and whether you're going to live in a free, prosperous society. Even more, you might, but your children and your grandchildren will not, unless we start tapping the brakes and then slamming the brakes. GAO's model is based on a 10-year and 30-year economic and fiscal projection by the Congressional Budget Office, 75-year projections by the Board of Trustees for Social Security and Medicare, and the 75-year fiscal projections developed by the Office of Management and Budget. You got CBO, you got the GAO, you got the OMB, you got all the big alphabet soups that matter. What did they say? The debt was about 97% of the GDP at the end of fiscal year 22. What does that mean? GDP is all the value of the economy that the private economy creates, produces through production of products and services. 97% of that equals our annual debt. So we're barely producing enough to outpace the debt each year. But that's 2022. According to GAO's simulation, is on track to reach a historical high of 106% in 2029 and 212% by 2050. Without any change, GAO estimates that the debt will reach 625% of GDP in 2096. When your grandchildren are the age of about 50 or 60, the economy won't exist anymore. It's dead. It's completely dead. That is the burden we're placing on them. And honestly, while the Republican Party has participated in this, they're the only party that's trying to fix it. But we'll raise taxes. That won't even come close to fixing this. Not even close. If nothing's done to reduce the future deficits, the debt burden will become unbearable, they write, triggering a vicious circle of growing deficits and higher costs to finance the debt. We're being warned right now. The pots and pans are being banged, but not by the media. Have you noticed? They're not all that worked up about it. And yet with all the spending and all the regulation and all the taxes and all the bureaucrats, we're short personnel in the air tower at Reagan to make sure we're safe. More on that in a second. The U.S. federal government is among the most indebted governments on the face of the earth. As of 2022, the latest available data, federal debt reached 110% of GDP, so we have now passed 96%, ranking 18th highest out of 161 countries, for which the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has data. Japan tops the ranking with central government debt at 214% of GDP, followed by Greece, Eritrea, Italy, Singapore. Aren't we proud? Not long ago, the U.S. was among the least indebted countries. In 2001, U.S. federal debt was about 41% of GDP, lower than debt levels found in 99 other countries. But what happened? Obama, the pandemic, and Biden. That's what happened. This is from the U.S. Treasury Department fiscal report. The debt to GDP ratio was approximately 97% at the end of FY 2023. We just talked about that. Under current policy and based on this report's assumptions, it is projected to be, and I'm underscoring this, 531% in 2098. The continuous rise of the debt to GDP ratio indicates that current fiscal policy is unsustainable. Unsustainable, the word used by the Treasury Department. Unsustainable, the word used by the Office of Management and Budget. Unsustainable, the word used by the Congressional Budget Office. Unsustainable, the word used by the General Accountability Office. Unsustainable. At just under $36 trillion in debt, that's over $270,000 per household. That's your mortgage. But it's even worse than that, America. Do you know the federal government is running such a Ponzi scheme that it doesn't account to you for the off-budget debt? Mark, what are you talking about? The greatest expenditures we have in this country, in the federal budget, are the so-called entitlement programs, including Social Security and Medicare. They already robbed those funds of all their money. We now have IOUs in those funds, IOUs to the Treasury. In other words, debt on top of debt. But don't worry, you probably get an annual update, those of you who are near retirement, telling you about what's in your account. Problem is you don't have an account. So we have to play along with this Ponzi notion. But what do we owe ourselves under these entitlement programs? Social Security and Medicare. You know, if you run a private business, you have to account to the federal government, to all the regulators, federal, state, and local, how much money you owe your employees in terms of pensions or other non-daily, non-annual expenses. And they want to look at your books, and they should. But that's not how the federal government does its accounting. If we include the promises made under Social Security and Medicare to we the people who've paid into these systems, if you get a paycheck, you're dinged for it. Every single damn paycheck. That's the plan, right? But how much indebtedness have we created there? But Mark, it's a go-along plan. Not anymore. How much is it? Estimates are anywhere from 160, ready for this, trillion to close to 300 trillion. Did you hear what I said? This 36 trillion stuff, that's just about a tiny piece of the budget, the discretionary part of the budget. I talked about this a few months ago on this program. That's like 20-25% of the budget. When you talk about the big parts of the budget, you're talking about these so-called entitlement programs that we've paid into, that we were told was insurance. We expect the government to use proper accounting system. They did not. They stole the money. It's all spent. But if we play along with the scheme, we owe ourselves anywhere from 160 trillion to upwards of $300 trillion. Now, when are we going to pay that off? Never. Never. So let's circle back. The reason there aren't enough people, air traffic controllers, in that tower at Reagan National Airport, the reason there aren't enough people on the border to protect this country, the reason why the federal government blows $250 billion every year to waste, fraud, and abuse, $250 billion every year, is because they're involved in everything and they do nothing well. Now, when you see Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and the Democrats on Capitol Hill, every time there's an effort to reform any of these programs, anytime there's an effort to pull back some spending, anytime there's an effort, even over the long haul, over 10 years, 20 years, to really try to reduce the federal debt, they fearmonger, don't they? They scaremonger. They tell you that they're out to get your favorite program. And maybe they are, because you know where the vast majority of the on-budget money goes? Does anybody know? Redistribution of wealth. Not really to pay for things that the federal government's supposed to pay for. Vast sums of money sent to individuals under vast number of programs. Vast sums of money that are sent to states to fund a vast number of programs, and localities to fund a vast number of programs. The vast majority of money that the federal government spends on budget, putting aside entitlements, is to redistribute wealth to many of you. To many of you. And so the Democrats don't want to cut anything. Oh, they'll say, let's cut defense. Defense has been cut. And yet that's the main job of the federal government, isn't it? To protect us, since the states don't run foreign policy. Or they'll tell you the rich don't pay enough. Really? Since Congress last balanced the budget in 2001, revenues have grown at a robust annual average rate of 3.9%, which was higher than the average inflation rate since 2001, which was 2.5%. The problem is that the spending has grown at a much faster pace, 5.5% annually, which has led to today's large deficits. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, projects that federal revenues will grow strongly over the coming decade of an annual average of about 4.2%. However, without reform, spending is expected to grow even faster and thus push deficits even higher. And so when they talk about Medicare for all, they want to create a new massive program for which there's no money. And they want to keep centralizing power, centralizing government, keep redistributing wealth. Because the Constitution, doesn't matter to the Democrats or the big spending Republicans. It just doesn't matter anymore. This is why we didn't have enough people in the tower at Reagan. And this is why the government fails on so many fronts. This is why they want to destroy Donald Trump and his brand new administration, even when he proposes the most modest steps. And right now they're looking at 1,200 programs. They're trying to get the federal bureaucracy under control. They're looking for ways to cut, to reform, to create efficiencies, and they're being blocked every step of the way by radical left-wing groups who basically represent the Democrat Party, who go to their favorite cherry-picked judges, appointed by Obama, appointed by Biden, appointed by Clinton, even some by Reagan under these various deals that were set in order to stop Trump. If Donald Trump does not succeed, the country's going to fail. Not because of you and me, not because of the American spirit of red-blooded Americans, but because of the bureaucracy, the Democrat Party, the media, and all these surrogates, these non-government type entities and so forth, a cabal that does not believe in capitalism, limited government, and your Constitution.